The snow came down in sheets that night, thick and merciless, turning the forest into a white tomb. Mikhail Orlov pressed his back against the frozen bark of a pine tree, his breath forming clouds that vanished into the darkness. Behind him, what remained of his unit, 11 men out of the original 47, struggled to maintain formation. Their faces were hollowed by exhaustion, eyes sunken deep into skulls that seemed too large for the skin stretched across them. 3 days ago, they had been part of the 214th Rifle Division, a respectable fighting force positioned along the Dnieper salient. Now they were ghosts, fleeing through enemy-held territory after their entire front had collapsed in less than 6 hours. Orlov wiped ice crystals from his stubbled jaw and checked his compass again. The needle trembled in the weak moonlight, pointing northeast, deeper into German-controlled forest. Every instinct screamed to turn west, to run for their own lines. But that route was suicide. The enemy would be expecting stragglers to retreat that way. No, their only chance was to move laterally through the wilderness, circle wide, and pray they found a gap in the enemy's advance. "Commander!" The whisper came from Sergeant Dmitry Volkov, a bear of a man whose thick coat couldn't hide the way his shoulders shook from cold. "Petrov's fever is getting worse. He can't keep pace." Orlov didn't turn around. He'd heard this report twice already. Private Petrov had taken shrapnel to the thigh during the retreat, a wound that should have been survivable with proper medical attention. But there was no proper medical attention here. There was only infected flesh, rising temperature, and the slow certainty of death. "How long?" Orlov asked. "Hours, maybe. A day, if we're lucky." "We're never lucky, Dmitri." Behind them, someone coughed, a wet rattling sound that spoke of pneumonia or worse. The cold was killing them almost as efficiently as German bullets. Orlov had already lost 2 men to exposure, their bodies left behind because they couldn't afford the time to bury them. "Commander, we need to find shelter," Volkov pressed. "A village, a barn, anything. Villages mean people. People mean questions. Questions mean a bullet in the head from either side." Orlov's voice was flat, stripped of emotion by 3 days of running. "We keep moving. Then Petrov dies." "Petrov's already dead. He just doesn't know it yet." The words hung in the frozen air like an accusation. Volkov said nothing, but Orlov could feel the sergeant's judgment boring into his back. There had been a time when such callousness would have sickened him too, but that time felt like it belonged to a different man, someone who'd existed before the front collapsed, before he'd watched his commanding officer take a shell fragment through the throat and die choking on his own blood while screaming orders that no one could understand. That man was gone. In his place stood someone who understood that sentiment was a luxury paid for in graves. "Get him on his feet," Orlov said finally. "We move in 2 minutes." Volkov retreated into the darkness, and Orlov allowed himself a moment to close his eyes. Just one moment. The exhaustion was like a physical weight pressing down on his chest, making every breath an effort. When was the last time he'd slept? Really slept, not just collapsed into unconsciousness for 20 minutes before jerking awake at every sound? He couldn't remember. A hand touched his shoulder, and Orlov's eyes snapped open, fingers already moving toward the pistol at his hip. But it was only Corporal Anatoly Grekov, the unit's former scout, a thin, nervous man with quick eyes that never stopped moving. "Movement ahead," Grekov whispered. 200 meters, maybe less." Orlov's fatigue vanished like smoke. "How many?" "Couldn't tell. Heard voices. German, I think, but the wind's playing tricks." "Show me." They moved through the forest like shadows, Grekov leading the way with the practiced silence of someone who'd spent years hunting in these woods before the war had conscripted him. Orlov followed, careful to step where the corporal stepped, avoiding the patches of ice that would crack underfoot and announce their presence to anyone listening. The voices grew louder as they approached, definitely German, rough and casual. Soldiers relaxing, not expecting trouble. Orlov and Grekov dropped to their stomachs at the edge of a small clearing, and what Orlov saw made his blood freeze in a way the weather never could. A patrol. 8 men, maybe 10, clustered around a small fire that they'd somehow managed to shield from aerial observation. They wore the field gray uniforms of Wehrmacht infantry, their weapons stacked carelessly against a fallen log while they passed around what looked like a bottle of schnapps. Behind them, barely visible through the trees, Orlov could make out the dark shape of a truck. Transport, probably, which meant these weren't combat troops. Support personnel. Rear echelon. Which raised the question, what were they doing this deep in the forest? "We could take them," Grekov breathed. "Hit fast, grab their supplies." "No." Orlov's response was immediate. A firefight would bring every German unit within 5 kilometers down on their heads, and his men were in no condition for a running battle. "We go around." "Commander, they've got food, medical supplies. That truck probably has—" "I said no." But even as the words left his mouth, Orlov's attention was drawn to something beyond the German patrol. Through the trees, perhaps half a kilometer distant, he could see lights. Not campfires or truck headlights, fixed lights, industrial lights, creating a dull glow against the low-hanging clouds. A facility of some kind, big enough to power exterior lighting even in the middle of a war zone. "You see that?" he asked Grekov. The corporal squinted into the darkness. "Looks like maybe a factory or a garrison?" "Neither. Look at the terrain." Grekov studied the landscape, and Orlov saw the moment understanding dawned in the man's eyes. The ground sloped gradually downward toward those lights, and through gaps in the forest canopy, they could glimpse something that reflected the moon with a dull metallic sheen. Water. A lot of it. "A dam," Grekov whispered. Orlov felt his pulse quicken. A dam this far behind enemy lines, heavily guarded, with enough strategic importance to warrant permanent lighting even during wartime. He pulled out the crumpled map he'd salvaged from division headquarters, stained with someone else's blood and barely legible, and tried to orient himself. If his calculations were correct, if they hadn't drifted too far east during the retreat, the Volkovka Dam, he said quietly. "It has to be." Grekov sucked in a breath. "I thought that was just rumor. Command kept talking about it, but not rumor. Intelligence reported it 3 months ago. The Germans captured it intact when the front collapsed, and they've been using it to regulate water flow for their supply barges downstream." Orlov traced a finger along the map's waterways. "Every ton of ammunition, every drop of fuel moving to their forward positions passes through channels fed by this reservoir. Then our Air Force should have blown it to hell by now. You see any of our planes in the sky lately, Corporal?" Grekov had no answer to that. The Luftwaffe had owned the skies for weeks now, and what remained of Soviet air assets was being husbanded for critical operations, which apparently didn't include a dam in the middle of nowhere. But it wasn't nowhere, Orlov realized. It was everywhere. Control the water, control the transportation network. Control the transportation network, control the supply chain, control the supply chain. "We need to destroy it," he said. Grekov stared at him like he'd suggested flying to the moon. "Commander, we're 11 men with maybe 200 rounds between us, and I know what we have." Orlov's mind was already racing through possibilities, calculations, scenarios. "The question is what they have. Guards, obviously. But how many? What kind of defenses? Where are the weak points?" "You're serious?" "This could be the most important target within 100 kilometers, and we're the only Soviet unit anywhere near it." Orlov folded the map and tucked it back inside his coat. "If we do nothing, we're just 11 more bodies frozen in the snow. But if we succeed, we're heroes. If we fail, we're corpses. And if we try and run after, we're deserters." Grekov shook his head. "Commander, even if we somehow pull off a miracle and blow that dam, our own people will shoot us. We're behind enemy lines without orders. Command doesn't know we're alive. The moment we show our faces, we'll be assumed to be collaborators or deserters, or then we make sure Command knows exactly what we did and why." Orlov met the corporal's eyes. "You think I don't understand the situation? I've been running the math in my head for 3 days. Every scenario ends badly, so we might as well pick the ending that means something." The German patrol's laughter drifted through the trees, oblivious to the conversation happening mere meters away. Orlov watched them for a moment longer, then began backing away from the clearing. Grekov followed, questions written all over his face. When they were far enough from the Germans to risk speaking at normal volume, Orlov gathered what remained of his unit. They looked at him with eyes that expected nothing but more running, more cold, more death. 11 men. 5 of them were veterans from before the war, tough, experienced, but worn down by years of fighting. The other 6 were conscripts from the last mobilization, kids barely out of school who'd learned warfare the hard way. Petrov lay propped against a tree, his face flushed with fever despite the freezing temperature. Volkov knelt beside him, trying to make the dying man comfortable. The rest spread out in a loose perimeter, weapons ready, but hands shaking from exhaustion and cold. "Listen up," Orlov said quietly. "We've found a target, a big one." He explained what they'd discovered, watching their reactions. Disbelief, fear, and in a few faces, the veterans mostly, a flicker of something that might have been hope. "You're insane," someone muttered. Orlov thought it was Private Leonid Sokolov, one of the younger ones, but he couldn't be sure in the darkness. "Maybe," Orlov agreed, "but think about it. We're dead men walking anyway. The cold will kill us, or the Germans will, or our own side will when we try to make it back through the lines. At least this way we die doing something that matters." "And if we succeed?" Volkov asked. "Then we're not deserters. We're saboteurs operating behind enemy lines. There's precedent for that. Special operations, partisan actions. Command might even pin medals on us. Or they might shoot us for losing the unit," Volkov countered. 47 men reduced to 11? Someone's going to want answers for that, and the entire front collapsed isn't going to satisfy the NKVD. The mention of the secret police sent a ripple of unease through the group. The NKVD, People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, was feared by soldiers almost as much as the enemy. They were the ones who shot cowards and traitors, who stood behind the lines with machine guns to ensure retreating soldiers would rather face German bullets than flee. They were the ones who asked questions with fists and electricity until you confessed to crimes you hadn't committed. And they were the ones who would be very interested in how an entire division had evaporated while 11 men somehow survived. "I'm not saying it's safe," Orlov admitted. "Nothing about this is safe. But between dying meaninglessly in the snow and dying in a way that might actually hurt the enemy, I'll take the second option every time." He paused, letting that sink in. Then he added the part he knew would resonate with the veterans. "Besides, imagine the look on those German bastards' faces when a reservoir's worth of water comes crashing down on their supply barges." That got a few dark chuckles. These men had lost friends, family, entire villages to the invasion. The idea of striking back, really striking back, not just surviving another day, touched something primal. "I need volunteers," Orlov continued. "Anyone who doesn't want to risk this can head west, try to make it back through the lines on their own. No judgment. But I'm doing this whether you're with me or not." Silence fell over the group. Orlov counted heartbeats, waiting. This was the moment that would define everything, whether he was a commander or just a desperate man talking to himself. Volkov stood first. "I'm in. This damn war's taken everything from me already. Might as well take something back." Grekov nodded. "Someone needs to keep you from getting shot before you reach the dam." One by one, the others rose. Even the young ones, the conscripts who should have been terrified. In the end, only Petrov remained sitting, and that was because he couldn't stand. "Petrov?" Orlov asked quietly. The dying man's fever-bright eyes found him. "Leave me. A grenade," he rasped. "In case Germans find me. I'll give you time." Orlov felt something twist in his chest. He wanted to refuse, to insist they'd carry Petrov with them, but they both knew the truth. The private had hours at most, and those hours would be spent in agony. A grenade was mercy. He pulled one from his belt and placed it carefully in Petrov's hand, making sure the pin was secure. "You're a good soldier," Orlov said. "Was," Petrov corrected with a ghost of a smile. "Now, I'm just bait." They left him there, propped against his tree, grenade clutched to his chest like a talisman. Orlov didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. The unit moved through the forest with renewed purpose, circling wide around the German patrol. Orlov set a route that would bring them to the dam from the north, where the terrain offered better cover. As they walked, he began sketching a plan. "Grekov, You and Sokolov will scout the perimeter, he whispered. I need to know guard positions, shift changes, any weak points in their defenses. And if there are no weak points, Grekov asked, then we make one. Orlov turned to Volkov. How many explosives do we have left? The sergeant did a quick inventory. 2 satchel charges, half a dozen grenades. Not enough to bring down a dam. We don't need to bring it down, just damage it enough that it fails on its own. Orlov had seen dams before, knew the basics of how they worked. Water's patient. Give it a crack and it'll do the rest. That's assuming we can even get close enough to plant charges, Volkov pointed out. The Germans aren't stupid. They'll have that thing locked down tight. Which is why we're not going through the front door. Over the next hour, as they crept closer to the dam, Orlov refined his plan. It was insane, desperate, and relied on a dozen things going exactly right. But it was a plan, which was more than they'd had an hour ago. The forest began to thin as they approached the reservoir, and Orlov called a halt. Ahead through the trees, they could see the dam more clearly now. A massive concrete structure stretching across the valley, holding back what must have been millions of tons of water. Lights dotted its length, and Orlov could make out the silhouettes of guards patrolling the top. Below the dam, a hydroelectric station hummed with activity. Germans moved in and out of the building, their voices carrying on the wind. Orlov counted at least 20 soldiers, possibly more inside. Heavily defended, Grekov murmured. As expected. Orlov studied the layout, memorizing every detail. But they're defending against an attack from the front. Air raids, saboteurs coming up from the valley. They're not expecting anyone to come from behind. He pointed to the northern edge of the reservoir, where the shoreline curved close to the dam's foundation. We approach from there. Stay low. Use the darkness. Once we're at the base of the dam, we plant charges on the waterward side where the pressure's greatest. Even a small breach will... A sound cut him off, distant but unmistakable, the crack of a grenade detonating. Petrov. Orlov's hand clenched into a fist. The private had bought them time, just as he'd promised. Now German patrols would converge on that location, searching for survivors or partisans. It would draw forces away from the dam. Move, Orlov ordered. Fast and quiet. They descended toward the reservoir like wraiths, using every scrap of cover the terrain offered. The snow had stopped, leaving the landscape frozen and still. Orlov's boots crunched on ice, and he winced at every sound, certain it would bring searchlights and gunfire. But the Germans remained focused on the dam itself, not the forest behind it. They reached the shoreline and spread out, moving along the water's edge. The reservoir was massive, its surface like black glass reflecting the moon. Somewhere beneath that surface were sluice gates, turbines, all the machinery that made this facility valuable to the enemy. And somewhere above them, tons of concrete held back an ocean of destruction. Grekov and Sokolov split off to scout, vanishing into the shadows. The rest of the unit took cover among rocks and frozen scrub, waiting. Orlov checked his watch, a German piece he'd looted off a dead officer weeks ago, almost midnight. 15 minutes passed, then 30. Orlov was starting to wonder if the scouts had been caught when Grekov reappeared, breathing hard. 2 guards on the north face, he reported. They walk a pattern, 10 minutes from one end to the other, then back. There's a blind spot where the dam meets the hillside. We could reach the foundation without being seen if we time it right. And planting charges? That's the problem. The foundation's smooth concrete. Nothing to hide behind. We'll be completely exposed while we work. Orlov absorbed this. How long to set the explosives? 5 minutes if we're fast, 3 if we're desperate. So we need 3 minutes where those guards aren't looking. Orlov thought for a moment, then turned to Volkov. Create a distraction, something loud enough to pull their attention, but not so dramatic it brings the whole garrison down on us. What did you have in mind? Orlov pointed across the reservoir, to where the German patrol had been earlier. We left some friends over there. Maybe they're not as alone as they think. Understanding dawned in Volkov's eyes. A firefight, or the sound of one. Exactly. A few gunshots, some shouting. Germans will think partisans are hitting their support units. It'll draw the guards away from the dam long enough for us to work. It was a good plan. It should have worked. Volkov took 3 men and disappeared into the forest, moving to set up the distraction. Orlov and the remaining soldiers, 4, including himself, prepared the explosives. The satchel charges were crude but effective. Canvas bags stuffed with TNT and dynamite, fitted with timed fuses that could be set for anywhere between 30 seconds and 10 minutes. Grekov kept watch while they worked, his eyes never leaving the guards above. Orlov could see them clearly now. 2 Wehrmacht soldiers, rifles slung over their shoulders, cigarettes glowing in the darkness. They looked bored, cold, utterly convinced that nothing would happen on their watch. They were about to learn otherwise. The distraction went off right on schedule. Gunfire erupted from the forest, the sharp crack of Soviet rifles answered by the heavier thump of German weapons. Shouting followed, orders barked in both languages, and then someone fired a flare that lit up the tree line in sickly green light. The guards on the dam reacted instantly, turning toward the commotion. One of them reached for a radio, probably calling for reinforcements. "Now!" Orlov hissed. They burst from cover, running low and fast toward the dam's foundation. The distance was maybe 50 meters, but it felt like 50 kilometers. Every step expected to hear an alarm, a shout, gunfire. Nothing. They reached the base of the dam and pressed themselves against the concrete, breathing hard. Above them, the guards' voices were audible but not their words. The firefight in the forest continued. Volkov and his men were putting on quite a show. "Grekov, you're with me," Orlov said. "Sokolov, keep watch. If those guards come back, you signal." They worked with desperate speed, placing the satchel charges against the foundation where Grekov indicated, stress points, places where the concrete was already showing hairline cracks from years of pressure. Orlov's fingers were numb with cold, fumbling with fuses and detonation cord. 3 minutes, Grekov had said. They were already at 2. "Commander," Sokolov whispered urgently, "one of the guards is coming back." Orlov's heart hammered. They needed 30 more seconds. Just 30. The shooting in the forest stopped abruptly. No gradual decrease, no trailing shots. Just sudden, eerie silence. That was wrong. Firefights didn't end like that unless... "Ambush," Grekov breathed. "Volkov ran into something." No time to worry about that now. Orlov twisted the last fuse into place, checked the timer, 5 minutes. That should be enough. And activated it with a sharp pull. "Go," he ordered. They ran back the way they'd come, not bothering with stealth anymore. Behind them, the guard called out something in German, voice sharp with alarm. A searchlight clicked on, its beam sweeping across the foundation. Too late. They were already into the tree line, hearts pounding, lungs burning, but they weren't clear yet. More lights blazed to life across the dam. Sirens wailed. Germans poured out of the hydroelectric station, dozens of them, forming into search parties. And from the forest where Volkov had created his distraction came the sound Orlov had been dreading, captured men screaming as they were interrogated. "Commander!" Grekov grabbed his arm. "We have to go back for them." "With what? 4 men and a handful of bullets against a garrison?" Orlov's voice was ice. They knew the risks. "We can't just..." The explosion cut him off. It wasn't as loud as Orlov expected. More of a deep, resonant crack, like the earth itself splitting. But the effect was immediate and catastrophic. A chunk of the dam's foundation simply ceased to exist, replaced by a gaping wound from which water began to pour. Not a trickle. A torrent. Thousands of tons of pressure found that weakness and exploited it with relentless physics, widening the breach with every second. The Germans saw it instantly. The sirens changed pitch, going from alert to emergency. Men abandoned the search and ran for the dam, trying desperately to shore up the breach. They might as well have tried to hold back the ocean with their hands. The crack spread like lightning across concrete, racing up the face of the dam. Chunks began to fall, massive pieces of infrastructure crumbling into the valley below. And still the water came, growing from a stream to a river to a flood. "Back!" Orlov shouted. "Get to high ground!" They scrambled up the hillside as the dam began its death throes. The sound was indescribable. A deep, grinding roar mixed with the screams of men who realized too late that they were standing on a structure that was about to cease existing. The main breach came 5 minutes later. The entire central section of the dam collapsed in a thunderous cascade, releasing the reservoir in one catastrophic wave. Water exploded into the valley, a churning mass of destruction that swept away the hydroelectric station, the guard posts, the vehicles. Everything disappeared beneath the flood. German soldiers tried to run. Some made it to high ground. Most didn't. Orlov and his men watched from the hillside as the geography below them was rewritten. The valley filled with water, transforming from land to lake in minutes. Downstream, he knew, the supply barges would be hit by a wall of water traveling at the speed of a freight train. "We did it," Grekov said, voice filled with disbelief. "We actually did it." But Orlov was watching the forest where Volkov had disappeared. The screaming had stopped minutes ago, replaced by the methodical sound of gunfire. Single shots, spaced out, executions. "Grekov," he said quietly, "take Sokolov and circle west. Stay clear of German patrols, make for our lines however you can." "What about you?" "I'm going to get our people back." "Commander, they're already—" "I don't leave my men." Orlov met the corporal's eyes. "Alive or dead, I don't leave them. You understand?" Grekov understood. He'd been in the army long enough to know that sometimes orders weren't about logic. They were about what a man could live with. "Good luck, Commander." "Luck's got nothing to do with it." Orlov watched them disappear into the darkness. 2 more ghosts in a war full of them. Then he turned toward the sound of gunfire and began to walk. The Germans had set up a hasty command post in a clearing, probably using it to coordinate their response to the dam's destruction. Orlov counted 8 soldiers, plus the 3 prisoners they'd captured. Volkov was still alive, barely. They'd beaten him badly, and he knelt in the snow with blood streaming down his face. The other 2 men from the distraction team were already dead, their bodies dumped carelessly to one side. Orlov approached from downwind, moving with infinite patience. He had 1 magazine left for his rifle, 30 rounds, 8 Germans. The math wasn't good, but it wasn't impossible. He lined up his first shot, centering the sights on a German officer who seemed to be directing the interrogation. The man was asking Volkov questions in broken Russian, punctuating each query with a kick. Orlov pulled the trigger. The officer went down without a sound, and chaos erupted. Germans scattered, trying to find cover, but Orlov was already moving, firing as he ran. The element of surprise bought him 3 more kills before they started shooting back. Bullets tore through the trees around him. He dropped behind a fallen log and changed magazines, his last one, then resumed firing with mechanical precision. 2-round bursts aimed shots, each one dropping a soldier. But there were too many, and they were spreading out, flanking him. Then Volkov did something extraordinary. Despite his injuries, despite being on his knees with his hands bound, the sergeant threw himself at the nearest German. They went down in a tangle of limbs, and Volkov somehow got his teeth into the man's throat. The distraction was all Orlov needed. He rose from cover and emptied his magazine into the remaining Germans. When the firing stopped, 7 enemy soldiers lay dead or dying. The 8th, the one Volkov had attacked, was already dead, his throat torn out. Orlov ran to his sergeant and cut the ropes binding his hands. Volkov collapsed into the snow, coughing blood. "Damn!" he croaked. "Gone. You should see it. Biggest flood since Noah." Volkov managed a bloody smile. "Worth it then. We need to move. Can you walk?" "No." The sergeant's voice was fading. "Ribs. Broken. Something internal." Orlov knew a death sentence when he heard one. He'd pronounced it himself too many times, but knowing didn't make it easier. "Then I'll carry you." "Liar." Volkov's hand found Orlov's arm, gripped it with surprising strength. "You know what has to happen." "Dmitri." "Do it, Commander. That's an order from a dying man." Orlov wanted to refuse, wanted to insist they'd find a way, that miracles happened. But he'd stopped believing in miracles 3 days ago when the front collapsed. He drew his pistol. "You're a good soldier," he said, echoing the words he'd spoken to Petrov. "Better dead than captured," Volkov replied. Then, with his last breath, "Tell them, we won." The gunshot echoed through the forest, final and absolute. Orlov stood over his sergeant's body for a long moment, then methodically gathered what supplies he could from the German corpses. Ammunition, food, a better coat. He moved like an automaton, his mind carefully blank. 11 men had started this mission. Now it was just him. The dam was destroyed. The mission was complete. But as Orlov walked away from that clearing, leaving behind the bodies of friends and enemies alike, he knew the hardest part was still ahead. He had to survive long enough to tell someone what they'd done. And in a war where survival itself was suspect, where the NKVD shot men for having the audacity to not die with their units, that might be the most dangerous mission of all. Behind him, the valley continued to fill with water, erasing evidence, drowning secrets. And somewhere in the chaos of the collapsing front, people were making decisions that would determine whether Mikhail Orlov was a hero or a traitor. He just didn't know it yet. Miles away, in a city that had somehow avoided the worst of the fighting, a woman named Elena Markova stood at a window and watched snow fall on empty streets. She was waiting for news, any news, about the husband she hadn't heard from in 3 weeks. Tomorrow, that news would arrive. And when it did, it would shatter her world more completely than any bomb. But tonight, she simply watched the snow and prayed to God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. And in the forest, Mikhail Orlov walked alone through the darkness, heading toward a fate he couldn't see and wouldn't have believed if he could. The dam was broken. The war was far from over. And the hardest choices were still to come. The interrogation room smelled of stale tobacco and fear. Mikhail Orlov sat with his hands flat on the metal table, his posture rigid, eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the concrete wall. 3 days had passed since he'd stumbled through Soviet lines, half dead from exhaustion and exposure. 3 days of questions, suspicion, and the growing certainty that survival might have been the worst choice he could have made. The man across from him, Major Yevgeny Kashin of the NKVD, tapped ash from his cigarette into a tin tray and studied Orlov with the detached interest of a scientist examining bacteria. "Tell me again," Kashin said, his voice smooth as oil, "how 47 men became one." "I've already told you, 4 times." Orlov kept his voice level, though exhaustion made every word an effort. "The front collapsed. We were overrun. Most died in the initial assault. The rest fell during the retreat. Except you. Except me." Kashin leaned back in his chair, letting smoke curl toward the bare bulb overhead. The major was younger than Orlov expected. Mid-30s, perhaps, with the kind of face that revealed nothing. Clean-shaven, cold-eyed, wearing the dreaded green NKVD uniform like a second skin. "And then," Kashin continued, "this lone survivor, this miraculous commander who escaped when hundreds of others died, decided to destroy a German dam. We saw an opportunity. We took it. Kashin seized on the word. "But you just said you were alone." "I was alone when I crossed back through our lines. The men who helped destroy the dam are all dead." "Convenient. For who?" Orlov felt anger flare despite his exhaustion. "You think I wanted this? You think I wanted to watch my sergeant die in the snow because I couldn't carry him? You think—" "I think," Kashin interrupted quietly, "that your story raises more questions than it answers, Commander. Or should I still call you that? Your rank is provisional, given the circumstances." The threat hung in the air like the cigarette smoke. Orlov understood perfectly. The NKVD could strip his rank, declare him a deserter, and put a bullet in the back of his head before sunrise. No trial, no appeal, just another body in a war that devoured them by the thousands. "The dam is destroyed," Orlov said flatly. "German supply lines are disrupted. Aerial reconnaissance will confirm it. Whatever else you think I am, Major, I accomplished the mission." "A mission you gave yourself, without orders, behind enemy lines." Kashin stubbed out his cigarette with deliberate precision. "Do you understand how that looks? I understand that you're afraid I'm a collaborator, that the Germans let me go in exchange for intelligence, that this whole story is an elaborate cover for treason." Orlov met Kashin's eyes. "If I were working for the Germans, Major, I wouldn't have destroyed one of their most valuable assets. I would have brought you information about Soviet positions, codes, commanders. Instead, I brought you a flooded valley and dead fascists." For the first time, something flickered in Keishin's expression. Not quite approval, but perhaps a grudging respect for directness. "You're either the luckiest man alive," the major said, "or the most dangerous. I haven't decided which." "Neither have I." The door opened before Kashin could respond. A junior officer entered, whispered something in the major's ear. Kashin's eyebrows rose fractionally, then he nodded and waved the man away. "It seems," Kashin said slowly, "that your story has just become more interesting." Aerial reconnaissance did confirm the dam's destruction. They also found evidence of a firefight near the site. German bodies, Soviet weapons. He paused. "And survivors." Orlov's heart jumped. "Who?" "Two men. Corporal Anatoly Grekov and Private Leonid Sokolov. They made it through our lines this morning, half frozen and barely coherent, but coherent enough to tell a story that matches yours almost exactly." Kashin pulled out a fresh cigarette, but didn't light it, just rolled it between his fingers. "Almost exactly. There are some discrepancies, such as they claim you ordered them to escape while you went back for the others, that you deliberately sacrificed yourself to give them a chance." Kashin's eyes narrowed. "That doesn't sound like the action of a collaborator, Commander. It sounds like heroism, and heroism makes my job very complicated." Orlov said nothing. He'd thought Grekov and Sokolov were dead, lost in the forest, or captured by German patrols. The fact that they'd survived, that they'd corroborated his story, changed everything. But Kashin wasn't done. "Tell me about Sergeant Volkov's death," the major said. The question hit like a physical blow. Orlov's hands tightened on the table, knuckles going white. "He was mortally wounded during the firefight. I ended his suffering." "You executed him." "I gave him mercy." "Mercy." Kashin finally lit his cigarette, the match flare briefly illuminating his face. "In my experience, Commander, mercy is just another word for convenience. A wounded man slows you down, requires resources, makes noise. Much easier to put a bullet in his head and move on." "That's not—" Orlov caught himself, forced his voice back under control. "Sergeant Volkov asked me to do it. He knew he was dying. The Germans had broken his ribs, possibly punctured a lung. He couldn't walk, couldn't breathe properly. Leaving him alive would have meant carrying him, or staying with him, or any number of options that didn't involve killing one of your own men. He wasn't one of my own men. He was my friend." The words came out raw, unfiltered. "And if you've never had to look a friend in the eye and pull a trigger because it's the only kindness left to give, then you don't have the right to judge me for it." Silence fell over the room. Kashin smoked and watched, his expression unreadable. Outside, somewhere in the building's depths, someone screamed, a prisoner being interrogated less gently than Orlov. "You're right," Kashin said finally. "I don't have that right, but the state does. The state has the right to judge every action, every decision, every breath you take." He stood, walked to the window that looked out over the military compound. "You destroyed a strategic target. You survived when you shouldn't have. Your story checks out, your men confirm it, and reconnaissance backs it up. By all rights, you should be decorated, promoted, held up as an example. But you also lost 46 men. You operated without orders behind enemy lines. You killed a wounded soldier rather than attempt a rescue. And most damning of all, you survived when so many others didn't." Kashin turned from the window. "Survival itself is suspicious, Commander. It suggests flexibility, adaptability, a willingness to do whatever it takes. Those sound like qualities you'd want in a soldier. Or in a traitor." Orlov stood slowly, his chair scraping against concrete. "Am I under arrest, Major?" "Not yet." Kashin ground out his cigarette. "You're being reassigned. Special operations, sabotage, and reconnaissance behind enemy lines. Official designation, proper orders, everything legal and documented. You'll lead small teams into occupied territory and do exactly what you did at the dam, except with permission this time. And if I refuse? Then we'll revisit the question of whether Sergeant Volkov's death was mercy or murder. We'll take a much closer look at how those 46 men died. We'll ask more questions, and keep asking them until we get answers we like." Kashin smiled without warmth. "Do you refuse, Commander?" Orlov understood the game. The NKVD couldn't prove he was a traitor, so instead they'd use him. Send him on missions that were barely shy of suicide, let the war solve their problem. If he succeeded, the state got results. If he died, the state got rid of a suspicious survivor. Either way, Kashin won. "When do I start?" Orlov asked. "Tomorrow. There's someone you need to meet first." Kashin moved toward the door, then paused. "A word of advice, Commander. The next few months will determine whether you're remembered as a hero or a footnote. Choose your battles carefully." "I thought that's what I was doing when I destroyed the dam." "No," Kashin said quietly. "That was luck. What comes next is survival, and survival is much harder." The Major left, and guards appeared to escort Orlov to temporary quarters, a small room with a cot, a sink, and bars on the window. It was better than a cell, but not by much. He collapsed onto his cot and closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, his mind replayed the interrogation, analyzing every word, every implication. He was alive, for now, but alive in the service of men like Kashin, who saw soldiers as pieces on a board to be sacrificed when convenient. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd survived the Germans only to become a weapon for his own side. Somewhere in the building, that prisoner screamed again. Orlov tried not to imagine what was happening to them, tried not to wonder if that would be his fate if he failed the NKVD's expectations. He must have dozed eventually, because he woke to the sound of the door opening. A guard stood silhouetted in the doorway. "Get up! Someone wants to see you!" Orlov followed through corridors that all looked the same, bare concrete, harsh lighting, doors that revealed nothing of what lay behind them. They stopped at an office where the guard knocked twice, then stepped aside. "Enter," a woman's voice said. Orlov pushed through the door and stopped, surprise momentarily overwhelming his exhaustion. The woman behind the desk was young, early 30s at most, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that held the same cold assessment he'd seen in Kashin's. But where the Major's cruelty was overt, hers seemed wrapped in layers of bureaucratic efficiency. She wore a political officer's uniform, red star prominent on her collar. "Commander Orlov," she said, not rising. "I'm Commissar Elena Markova. Sit." He sat, studying her. Political officers were the party's watchdogs, embedded in military units to ensure ideological purity and report any signs of dissent. They had the authority to countermand military orders and could shoot commanders on the spot for defeatism or cowardice. They were feared, respected, and avoided when possible. "I've read Major Kashin's report," Elena said, pulling a folder from her desk. "Impressive, if true. 47 men to 1, a destroyed dam, a successful return through enemy lines. The kind of story that inspires soldiers." She looked up. "Or raises questions about how someone survives when everyone else dies." "The Major already covered this ground," Orlov said tiredly. "If you're here to accuse me of—" "I'm here to work with you, Commander. Your new assignment requires political oversight, and I've been selected to provide it." She closed the folder with a decisive snap. "We'll be partners, after a fashion. You handle military operations. I ensure those operations serve the state's interests." "You mean you'll watch me for signs of treason?" "That too." Elena's expression didn't change. "But mostly I'll be documenting your missions for propaganda purposes. The state needs heroes right now, Commander. The front is stabilizing, but morale is terrible. Desertion rates are climbing. Soldiers need to believe that individual action can make a difference. So I'm to be a propaganda tool." "We're all tools, Commander. The question is whether we're useful ones." She opened a different folder, this one containing what looked like mission briefings. "Your first assignment is straightforward. German forces are consolidating around a rail junction 200 kilometers east of here. Intelligence suggests they're using it to move heavy armor toward the front. We need it disrupted." "Disrupted meaning destroyed?" "Preferably, but intelligence gathering is acceptable if destruction proves impossible." Elena slid a map across the desk. "You'll have a team of 12, volunteers from various units, all experienced in sabotage or reconnaissance. I'll accompany you to observe and report." Orlov stared at her. "You're coming into the field? Is that a problem? Political officers don't usually—" I'm not a usual political officer, Commander. For the first time, something like emotion flickered in her eyes. I don't sit behind desks and sign execution orders. I go where my soldiers go. I see what they see. And if we fail, I fail with them. It should have sounded noble. Instead, it sounded like a challenge. Orlov realized this woman was testing him, measuring whether he was someone worth trusting or just another suspicious survivor. When do we leave? He asked. 48 hours. That gives you time to meet your team and plan the operation. Elena stood, signaling the meeting's end. A word of advice, Commander. The NKVD suspects you. The military doesn't trust you. Your own men will wonder if you're cursed or just incredibly lucky. The only way to change that is through results. Seems like a lot of pressure for someone you just met. Welcome to Special Operations. The pressure never stops. She moved to the door, then paused. One more thing. Major Cashin asked me to tell you something. He said, remember that mercy is a luxury. Do you understand what he means? Orlov understood perfectly. It was a warning about Volkov, about the choices he'd made in that forest. If he showed mercy again, if he hesitated to do whatever the mission required, Kashin would use it against him. I understand, he said. Good. Elena opened the door. Get some rest, Commander. You look like you haven't slept in days. I haven't. Then sleep now. Because once we're in the field, exhaustion won't be an excuse for failure. She left, and Orlov returned to his cell-like room. But sleep was even more elusive now. Instead, he lay on the cot and thought about what he'd become. A tool for the NKVD, a propaganda symbol, a commander of ghosts leading new soldiers into situations that would create more ghosts. Somewhere in the building, a telephone rang. Doors opened and closed. The machinery of war ground on, indifferent to individual suffering. And in another part of the compound, Elena Markova sat alone in her office, staring at a letter she'd received that morning. It was from the Military Records Department, informing her that her husband, Captain Alexei Markov, last stationed with the 89th Guards Division, was missing in action, presumed lost during the collapse of the front. Presumed lost. Such careful language. Not dead, not captured, just lost. As if he'd wandered off and might find his way back eventually. But Elena knew better. She'd spent 3 years as a political officer, 3 years watching men disappear into the meat grinder. Presumed lost was bureaucratic code for we don't know and probably never will. She crushed the letter in her fist, then carefully smoothed it out and filed it away. Emotion was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not now, when the state needed her to be strong, to be the perfect example of revolutionary dedication. Besides, there was something odd about Alexei's disappearance. The records department had been vague about details, citing operational security. But Elena had friends in intelligence, people who owed her favors. She'd made inquiries. What she'd learned made no sense. Alexei's unit had been overrun, yes. But several survivors reported seeing him alive after the battle, moving east rather than west, away from Soviet lines toward German-held territory. It could mean he was captured, or wounded and disoriented, or it could mean something far worse. Elena pushed the thought away and focused on the file in front of her. Commander Mikhail Orlov's complete military record. She read it carefully, looking for patterns, inconsistencies, anything that might explain how one man survived when 46 didn't. What she found was ordinary. Orlov was a competent officer, nothing special. Good marks in training, adequate performance in combat, no disciplinary issues. He'd been promoted to commander only because the previous officer had been killed, not through any particular merit. And yet this ordinary man had accomplished something extraordinary. The dam's destruction had disrupted German logistics for weeks, bought Soviet forces time to regroup and fortify positions. Military intelligence estimated it had delayed a major German offensive by at least 10 days. 10 days. In this war, that could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. So why did Kashin still suspect him? Why did the NK5D treat success like evidence of guilt? Because survivors were dangerous, Elena realized. They asked uncomfortable questions like, why did my friends die while I lived? They challenged the narrative that every death was necessary, that the state's decisions were always correct. They were living evidence that luck mattered more than ideology, that chaos ruled the battlefield more than any plan. And if luck ruled, if chaos decided fates, then what did that say about the state's control? About the party's promises of inevitable victory? Nothing good. Elena closed the file and checked her watch. Late evening, almost night. Tomorrow she'd meet with the team being assembled for Orlov's mission. Tomorrow she'd begin the process of documenting his actions, turning a suspicious survivor into a useful hero. But tonight, for just a few moments, she allowed herself to think about Alexei, to wonder where he was, what had happened, whether he'd tried to come back or had simply walked away. The thought was disloyal, dangerous, the kind of thing that got political officers investigated by their own organization. She buried it deep and forced her mind toward practical matters. The mission, the team, the propaganda value of a dramatic raid on German supply lines, anything but the growing suspicion that her husband hadn't gotten lost at all, that he'd chosen to disappear. And if that was true, if Alexei had defected or deserted or whatever the truth was, then Elena's entire life was about to collapse. Her position, her reputation, her future, everything depended on appearing beyond suspicion, beyond doubt, which meant she needed this mission to succeed, needed Orlov to prove himself a hero, not a traitor, needed results that would shield her from questions about her husband's loyalty. The irony was bitter. She was using Orlov as armor against suspicion, even while suspecting him herself. But that was the world they lived in now. A world where survival required constant vigilance, where trust was the first casualty of war, and where the line between hero and traitor could shift with a single rumor. Elena stood, turned off the light, and left her office. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of loyalty, new opportunities to prove herself useful to the state. Tonight, she just needed to sleep and forget. For a few hours, the growing certainty that the man she'd married was gone. Not lost, but deliberately, consciously gone. And that somewhere, in occupied territory, or beyond it, Alexei Markov was making choices that would destroy her if anyone learned the truth. Across the compound, Orlov finally slept, too exhausted to fight unconsciousness any longer. His dreams were confused, fragmented. He saw Volkov in the snow, saw Petrov with his grenade, saw the dam breaking again and again in loops of destruction. And in those dreams, a woman with cold eyes watched him, judging, measuring, waiting for him to fail. When he woke before dawn, he couldn't remember her face, but the feeling of being evaluated, of being tested in ways he didn't understand, stayed with him through breakfast and into the morning briefing. The team assembled in a barren meeting room was exactly what he expected. Hard men with harder eyes, the kind who'd survived too much to be impressed by anything. 12 of them, ranging from early 20s to late 40s, representing every branch of the service. Elena stood at the front of the room, crisp and professional, no sign of whatever private grief she carried. She introduced Orlov without fanfare, outlined the mission parameters, and made it clear that results were the only currency that mattered. "Questions?" she asked when she'd finished. A grizzled sergeant near the back raised his hand. "Just one, Commissar. How many missions has the commander led successfully?" Elena's gaze shifted to Orlov. "Commander?" "One," Orlov said honestly, "but it was a hell of a one." That got a few chuckles. The ice didn't break exactly, but it cracked a little. They spent the next 6 hours planning, arguing, refining strategies. Orlov outlined what he'd learned from the dam operation: the importance of reconnaissance, the value of distraction, the need for multiple escape routes. The team listened, contributed, pushed back when his ideas seemed weak. By evening, they had something resembling a workable plan. Risky, dependent on timing and luck, but workable. Elena watched from the corner, taking notes, saying nothing. But Orlov could feel her attention like a weight on his shoulders. She was cataloging every decision, every word, building a file that would determine his future. When the briefing ended and the team dispersed, she approached him. "You did well," she said. "They respect you, or at least they're willing to follow you. That's more than I expected." "What did you expect?" "Resistance. Questions about how you survived when others died. Accusations of cowardice or collaboration." Elena's expression remained neutral. The fact that they're willing to give you a chance suggests either they're very desperate or very pragmatic. or they recognize competence when they see it. Perhaps. She gathered her notes. We leave at dawn. Get whatever sleep you can, Commander. The next few days will determine whether you're a hero or a cautionary tale. And which do you think I'll be? Elena looked at him directly, and for just a moment, he saw past her professional mask to the grief and suspicion beneath. I think, she said slowly, that you're someone trying to survive in a world that punishes survival. Same as me. Same as everyone in this damned war. She paused. The difference is whether you use that survival to build something or just to keep breathing another day. What did you build, Commissar? The question seemed to surprise her. Excuse me? You survived something too. I can see it. Whatever made you into someone who goes into the field instead of staying behind a desk? What did you build from it? For a long moment she didn't answer. Then, purpose. I built purpose. And when that's taken from you, it's the only thing worth fighting for. She left before he could ask what she meant. Orlov returned to his quarters and tried to sleep, but his mind was too active. The mission, the team, Elena's cryptic words, they swirled together in a confused mass. Tomorrow they'd head into enemy territory. 12 soldiers, 1 political officer, and a commander whose loyalty was still questioned by the very people giving him orders. It should have been terrifying. Instead, Orlov felt something close to relief. In combat, at least, the rules were clear. Kill or be killed. Succeed or die trying. None of the political maneuvering, none of the suspicion and surveillance. Just the mission and whatever lay at the end of it. He checked his weapons one last time. Rifle, pistol, knife, grenades. The tools of his trade. Then he lay down and forced himself to stillness. Tomorrow would bring its own horrors. Tonight, he just needed to rest and prepare for whatever came next. In her own quarters, Elena sat with a second letter, one that had arrived that afternoon, delivered by a nervous courier who'd made her sign for it 3 times. It bore the seal of military intelligence. Her hands shook as she opened it. The contents were brief, clinical, devastating. Intelligence had confirmed that Captain Alexei Markov was alive. He'd been seen in German-occupied territory, apparently healthy and unrestrained. He was working with enemy forces, providing information about Soviet positions and unit strengths. Her husband was a collaborator, a traitor. And she, his wife, a political officer, someone responsible for maintaining ideological purity, was now compromised by association. The letter concluded with instructions. Report to NKVD headquarters immediately upon completion of current assignment. Prepare to answer questions about her husband's activities. Surrender all personal effects for review. In other words, her career was over. Her life as she knew it was finished. The only question was whether she'd be imprisoned, shot, or simply sent to a labor camp where she could disappear quietly. Unless she did something to prove her loyalty beyond question. Something dramatic enough to erase the stain of being married to a traitor. Elena looked at the mission folder on her desk, at Orlov's file sitting beside it. 12 soldiers. 1 commander. 1 political officer, a dangerous mission behind enemy lines, and a growing plan that made her stomach turn even as her mind calculated its possibilities. If the mission succeeded, if she documented every moment, if she performed some act of extraordinary dedication to the state, perhaps she could survive this. Perhaps she could transform being a traitor's wife into proof of her own incorruptible loyalty. But it would require sacrifices. Choices that would define who she was and what she'd become. Elena Markova had always believed she'd do anything for the state. Now she was about to find out if that belief was truth or just comfortable rhetoric. She burned both letters in her sink, watching the paper curl and blacken. Then she packed her gear for tomorrow's mission, moving with mechanical precision. Tomorrow she'd step into the field. And when she returned, if she returned, she'd be someone different, someone harder. Someone willing to do whatever survival required, just like Orlov. The parallel didn't escape her, and she smiled without humor at the irony. They were both broken by the same war, both suspect in the eyes of those they served, both trying to build something from the wreckage of their lives. The only question was what that something would cost, and whether the price was worth paying. Dawn came cold and gray, promising nothing but another day of struggle. Orlov and his team assembled in the compound yard while Elena conducted final inspections. They looked like wolves preparing to hunt, lean, dangerous, focused on one thing only: survival, and whatever came after. The truck rattled over frozen roads, carrying 13 souls toward enemy territory and whatever fate waited beyond the tree line. Orlov sat near the rear, watching the landscape blur past. Skeletal forests giving way to burnt villages, bomb craters filled with dirty snow, the occasional corpse frozen in positions that suggested final moments of terror or defiance. Elena sat across from him, her expression unreadable behind the scarf wrapped around her face. The rest of the team huddled in their coats, conserving warmth and energy for what lay ahead. Nobody spoke. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been covered in the briefings. They'd been traveling for 6 hours when the driver called back through the canvas, "End of the line! Can't go further without hitting German patrols." The team dismounted into knee-deep snow, and the truck immediately turned around, eager to escape back to safer territory. Orlov watched it disappear, feeling the finality of that departure. From this point forward, they were alone. "Form up," he said quietly. "Standard reconnaissance pattern. Grekov, you're on point. Everyone else, maintain 20-meter intervals." Grekov, the same corporal who'd survived the dam operation, nodded and moved ahead, his movements practiced and efficient. The others fell into formation without complaint, professionals doing what professionals did. Elena moved to walk beside Orlov, her boots crunching in the snow. "How far to the rail junction?" she asked. 40 kilometers, give or take. We'll cover it in stages, 10 kilometers today, find shelter, then push the remaining distance tomorrow night. Orlov checked his compass. "Intelligence says the junction is lightly defended, mostly supply personnel and garrison troops. But intelligence also said the front wouldn't collapse, so we plan for the worst. And if we encounter heavy resistance, then we gather information and withdraw. Dead heroes don't help anyone." Elena glanced at him. "That's a pragmatic view for someone who destroyed a dam with 11 men. "I had 11 men then. Lost all of them." Orlov's voice was flat. "I won't make that mistake again." They walked in silence for a while, the forest closing around them like a fist. This deep in occupied territory, every sound was potential danger. The crack of a branch could be wind or a German sniper settling into position. The distant rumble might be artillery or trucks moving supplies. Orlov had learned to listen beneath the obvious sounds, to hear the patterns that meant safety or threat. Right now, the forest felt empty, which was almost worse than feeling watched. Empty meant Germans controlled the area so thoroughly that even partisan groups had withdrawn. "Tell me about Volkov," Elena said suddenly. Orlov's jaw tightened. "Why?" "Because I need to understand who you are, Commander. And people reveal themselves in how they talk about the dead." "There's nothing to understand. He was a good soldier. He died badly. I ended it." Orlov kept his eyes forward. "That's the whole story." "No, it's not." Elena's voice carried a strange intensity. "The whole story includes why you went back for him when you could have escaped, why you risked yourself for a man who was already dying. That choice tells me something. It tells you I'm sentimental, which is a weakness. Or it tells me you understand loyalty means something even when it's inconvenient." She paused. "I need to know which, Commander. Because where we're going, I need to trust that you won't abandon your people when things get difficult." Orlov stopped walking and turned to face her. Around them, the team continued forward, maintaining formation but clearly aware of the conversation. "You want to know if I'm reliable?" he asked. "If I'll sacrifice myself for the mission, for the state, for whatever ideology you're supposed to enforce?" "The answer is no, Commissar. I'll sacrifice myself for my people because they're real. But abstract concepts like duty and honor and the motherland?" He shook his head. "Those died in the snow with Volkov." Elena's eyes narrowed. "That's dangerously close to sedition." "Then shoot me. Fulfill your function as a political officer." Orlov spread his arms. "But do it now, before we get any deeper into enemy territory. Because if you're going to question my loyalty every time I make a decision, this mission is already doomed." For a long moment, they stood facing each other while snow began to fall in lazy spirals. The team had stopped, watching, waiting to see how this confrontation would resolve. Finally, Elena spoke, her voice quiet but carrying clearly in the frozen air. "I'm not here to shoot you, Commander. I'm here to understand you. And what I understand so far is that you're honest about your limitations, which is more than most men in your position would admit. She lowered her voice further. I don't trust abstractions either, not anymore. So maybe we can work with that. Orlov studied her face, seeing past the political officer's mask to something raw beneath. Whatever had brought Elena to this moment, it wasn't simple ideology or career ambition. There was personal pain there, recent and deep. What happened to you? He asked. Nothing that concerns the mission. Everything concerns the mission, Commissar. If you're compromised, if you're making decisions based on, my husband is a traitor, Elena said flatly, cutting him off. He defected to the Germans or collaborated or whatever term makes it easier to digest. I received confirmation 2 days ago. The NKVD will question me when we return, and depending on what I say or do, I'll either be cleared or imprisoned, possibly shot. She met his eyes. So, yes, Commander, I'm compromised, but not in the way you think. I need this mission to succeed more than you do, because if it doesn't, I have nothing left to lose. The admission hung between them, raw and dangerous. Around them, the team pretended not to hear, but Orlov knew they were cataloging every word. Why tell me this? He asked. Because you told me the truth about Volkov, and because we're both in the same trap, suspected by our own side, trusted by no one, trying to prove ourselves through action. Elena's expression hardened. So here's what I propose. We do this mission. We do it well. We document everything so there's no question about what happened or why. And when we get back, we both have something to show the bastards who doubt us. And if we fail, then we die in the field instead of against a wall. I can live with that trade. Orlov considered her words, weighing the risks. A political officer admitting personal compromise was either incredibly brave or incredibly desperate. Probably both. But desperation made people dangerous. They took risks that rational minds would reject. On the other hand, desperation also made people focused. Elena wouldn't second-guess him to score ideological points. She wanted results, same as him. All right, he said finally. We work together. But in the field, my authority is absolute. No political oversight, no questioning orders in front of the men. We can argue in private, but publicly, we present a unified command. Agreed, but I document everything. That's non-negotiable. Document away. Just don't slow us down doing it. They shook hands, a strange formality in the middle of a frozen forest. Then Orlov raised his voice to address the team. Listen up. Some of you heard that conversation, and the rest will hear about it by nightfall. Here's what you need to know. The Commissar and I are on the same page. We're here to complete the mission and get everyone home alive. Politics, ideology, all that other noise, it stays behind the lines. Out here, we're just soldiers doing a job. Questions? Sergeant Yuri Petrov, no relation to the private who died at the dam, raised his hand. He was a thick-shouldered veteran with a face like cracked leather and eyes that had seen too much. Just one, Commander. If things go wrong, who makes the call to abort? I do, but I'll listen to input from anyone who has relevant information. Orlov looked at each man in turn. I'm not interested in dying for glory. We hit the target if we can. If we can't, we bring back intelligence. If even that's impossible, we come back with everyone alive. That's the priority order. Grekov spoke up from his position at point. And if we can't bring everyone back? The question hung in the air, weighted with meaning. Orlov knew what the corporal was really asking. Would he leave wounded behind the way he'd been forced to leave Petrov and Volkov? Then we carry them, Orlov said. Every man who can walk helps carry those who can't. We don't leave people behind unless they're already dead. Clear? A murmur of approval rippled through the team. It was the answer they'd needed to hear, the confirmation that their commander valued their lives as more than expendable resources. All right then, Orlov said. Let's move. We've got 30 kilometers before dark. They pushed deeper into occupied territory as afternoon faded toward evening. The forest grew denser, the silence more oppressive. Grekov spotted German tracks twice, boot prints in the snow, maybe a day old, but no sign of active patrols. That changed around dusk. Grekov's hand signal brought the entire team to an immediate halt. Enemy contact ahead. Orlov moved forward in a crouch, joining the corporal behind a fallen log. "There," Grekov whispered, pointing. Through gaps in the trees, Orlov could see a small clearing where Germans had established a temporary checkpoint. 2 trucks, maybe 8 soldiers, and what looked like a field telephone setup. They were checking papers for a convoy of civilian vehicles, refugees probably, trying to move through occupied territory. "We go around," Orlov decided. "Commander, that telephone." Elena had appeared beside them, silent as a ghost. If they're coordinating traffic through this area, they might have information about the rail junction's defenses. Not worth the risk. 8 soldiers, maybe more in those trucks. We engage them, and every German unit in 10 kilometers comes running. What if we don't engage? What if we just listen? Orlov looked at her. "Explain." Elena pointed to a thick cluster of brush about 30 meters from the checkpoint. Standard German field telephone uses open lines for local communication. If someone could get close enough, they might overhear conversations about troop movements, supply schedules, anything that could help us plan the raid. Someone meaning you. "I speak German. Studied it before the war." Elena's expression was determined. "Give me 20 minutes. If I don't learn anything useful, we move on as planned." It was risky, but not suicidal. Orlov weighed the potential intelligence against the danger of exposure. Finally, he nodded. "Take Grekov with you. He'll cover your approach and extraction, but the second anything feels wrong, you abort. Understood?" "Understood." Orlov watched them slip away into the forest, their movements coordinated and careful. The rest of the team spread out in a defensive perimeter, weapons ready but safeties engaged. 15 minutes crawled past. Then Elena's voice crackled over the short-range radio they'd been issued. "Command, this is Observer. You need to hear this." "Go ahead." "The rail junction isn't just a supply depot. They're using it to move prisoners. Political prisoners, resistance fighters, anyone the Germans consider dangerous. There's a train scheduled to depart tomorrow night, heading west toward labor camps." Orlov felt his stomach tighten. Prisoners complicated everything. The mission was supposed to be simple sabotage, not a rescue operation. "How many prisoners?" he asked. A pause while Elena presumably listened to more German conversation. Then, "At least 200, maybe more. They're being held in the junction's warehouse pending transport." "Observer, return to position. We'll discuss at the rally point." But Elena wasn't finished. "Command, there's something else. I heard them mention a Soviet officer by name, Captain Alexei Markov. He's apparently working as a translator and consultant for the German garrison commander." Orlov heard the strain in her voice, even through the radio's distortion. Alexei Markov, Elena's husband. The traitor she'd mentioned. He was here, at the rail junction, working with the enemy. "Understood," Orlov said carefully. "Return to position. That's an order." Elena and Grekov materialized from the forest 10 minutes later. The commissar's face was pale but composed, her expression locked down tight. She said nothing as they regrouped and moved away from the checkpoint, putting distance between themselves and potential discovery. They walked for another hour before Orlov called a halt in a defensible position, a small ravine that offered cover and concealment. While the team set up a cold camp, no fires or lights, Orlov pulled Elena aside. "Are you compromised?" he asked bluntly. "What?" "Your husband is at the target location. You just learned that the man you married is actively collaborating with the enemy. So I'm asking, are you still capable of making rational decisions? Or am I going to have to worry about personal vendettas interfering with the mission?" Elena's jaw clenched. "I'm a professional, Commander. My personal feelings, don't give me that. We both know this changes everything." Orlov kept his voice low but intense. "If we raid that junction and your husband is there, what happens? Can you treat him like any other enemy? Or will you hesitate, try to talk to him, compromise the team's safety because of who he used to be?" "I don't know," Elena admitted, and the honesty in her voice was more convincing than any declaration of duty would have been. "I don't know what I'll do if I see him, but I know what I should do, what I have to do. Which is? Treat him like the traitor he is." Her hands were shaking despite the cold composure of her face. "He made his choice. Now I have to make mine." Orlov studied her, trying to read whether this was genuine resolve or self-deception. Finally, he said, "The prisoners complicate things. Our mission is to disrupt the rail junction, not conduct a rescue. Saving 200 people sounds noble, but it could cost us everything. The mission, the team, any chance of getting home." "I know, but if we do nothing, those people are headed to camps they probably won't survive." "I know that too." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of impossible choices pressing down. Around them, the team was settling in for a cold night, eating rations, checking weapons, trying to stay warm. Sergeant Petrov approached, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. "Commander, the men are asking what we do about the prisoners." The men heard that conversation? Grekov told them, figured they deserved to know what we're walking into. Petrov's expression was neutral. "Some are saying we should hit the junction hard, free whoever we can. Others think that's suicide. Wanted me to get your decision before opinions harden into arguments." Orlov looked at Elena, then at Petrov, then at the rest of the team visible in the failing light. They were watching him, waiting for leadership, for someone to make the call that would define what kind of people they were. "Here's what we're going to do," he said finally. "Primary mission remains the same: sabotage the rail junction, disrupt German supply lines. But if we can incorporate prisoner extraction into that objective without compromising the team's survival, we do it. If we can't, we complete the primary mission and withdraw." "That's not exactly decisive, Commander," Petrov observed, "because the situation isn't clear yet. We don't know the junction's layout, guard strength, how the prisoners are secured. We need reconnaissance before we make concrete plans." Orlov raised his voice slightly so the entire team could hear. "Tomorrow we scout the target. We gather intelligence. We identify weak points and opportunities. Then we make a plan that accomplishes as much as possible while keeping everyone alive. That's how we do this." It wasn't the stirring speech they might have wanted, but it was honest. The team seemed to accept that, settling back into their positions. Elena moved closer to Orlov, her voice barely audible. "Thank you." "For what?" "For not dismissing the prisoners as expendable. For at least trying to find a way to help them." "Don't thank me yet. Trying doesn't mean succeeding." Orlov pulled his coat tighter against the cold. "Get some rest, Commissar. Tomorrow's going to be difficult." But rest proved elusive. Orlov took first watch, sitting with his back against frozen earth while his mind churned through scenarios. Every plan he constructed ran into the same problem. They were 13 people against an unknown number of Germans, trying to accomplish two objectives that pulled in different directions. Sabotage required stealth, precision, minimal engagement. Prisoner rescue required speed, violence, chaos. Combining them meant accepting risks that no rational commander would approve, which was probably why Orlov found himself constructing a plan that did exactly that. When Elena relieved him for second watch, he was sketching diagrams in the dirt with a stick, working through possibilities. "Can't sleep?" she asked. "Can't stop thinking." He showed her the diagrams. "Here's what I'm considering. We hit the junction at shift change. Guards are distracted, people moving around, natural chaos. Two-team approach. Alpha team creates a diversion on the western side, draws German response. Beta team infiltrates from the east, plants explosives on the rail lines and fuel depot. Once explosives are set, Beta moves to the warehouse, breaches it, arms whatever prisoners are capable of fighting. And then? Then everything goes to hell in a coordinated fashion. Explosives detonate, junction erupts into chaos, prisoners scatter in every direction. Germans try to contain multiple situations simultaneously, spread their forces thin. We extract during the confusion, using the prisoners' escape as cover." Elena studied the crude map. "It's insane." "It's what we've got." "No, I mean literally insane. Too many variables, too much that can go wrong. One delay, one guard who doesn't follow the pattern, and the whole thing collapses." She paused. "It might actually work." The dam operation had worse odds. "The dam operation cost you 11 men. Which is why I'm trying to learn from it." Orlov erased the diagrams with his boot. "But you're right. Too many variables. We need better intelligence. Tomorrow, we get close enough to actually see what we're dealing with." They sat together in the darkness, two people carrying impossible burdens, trying to find a way forward that didn't require sacrificing everything they'd sworn to protect. "Can I ask you something?" Elena said eventually. "Depends on the question." "When you went back for Volkov, knowing he was dying, knowing it risked your own escape, what were you thinking?" Orlov considered the question. "I wasn't thinking. Thinking would have told me to run. I was just responding. He was my friend. Leaving him there, alive and in pain, wasn't something I could do and still live with myself." "Even if it meant dying alongside him?" "Even then." Elena nodded slowly. "I used to believe the state was worth that kind of sacrifice. That dying for the revolution, for the people, for something larger than myself, that it meant something. But now—" She trailed off. "Now you're not sure what you believe. Now I think maybe the only things worth dying for are the people right in front of you, not abstract concepts, not political systems, just the human beings you can actually see and touch and save." It was a dangerous admission for a political officer to make, the kind of thing that could get her arrested if anyone reported it. But Orlov understood the impulse that drove the confession, the need to say the truth out loud, even if only once, even if only to someone equally compromised. "The prisoners," he said. "You want to save them because they're real, because if we don't, they become statistics." "Yes. And your husband? If we encounter him?" Elena's expression went cold. "He stopped being real when he chose the Germans over his own people. Whatever I felt for him died with that choice." Orlov wasn't sure he believed her, but he understood the need to believe it herself. Sometimes lies we told ourselves were the only things that kept us functional. Dawn came slowly, reluctant and gray. The team woke in shifts, ate cold rations, prepared weapons and equipment. Nobody spoke much. There was a tension in the air, the pre-combat feeling that something was about to break. Orlov briefed them on the reconnaissance plan. He'd take Grekov and 2 others to scout the junction up close, while Elena remained with the main group at a fallback position. They'd observe for 12 hours, document everything, and return to plan the assault. "What if you're compromised?" Elena asked. "Then you complete the primary mission without us. Hit the junction, damage what you can, extract." Orlov checked his watch. "We'll be back by nightfall. If we're not, assume the worst and proceed accordingly." He selected his team, Grekov, Sergeant Petrov, and a young private named Mikhail Sokolov, who had sharp eyes and steadier nerves than his age suggested. 4 men moving quietly could get much closer than 13. They set out at first light, leaving the others behind. The final approach took 3 hours of careful movement, freezing whenever they heard engines or voices, always staying just inside the tree line. When they finally reached a vantage point overlooking the rail junction, what Orlov saw made his blood run cold. The junction was much larger than intelligence had suggested. Not just a few buildings, but an entire complex. Multiple rail lines converged here, serviced by warehouses, barracks, administrative buildings, and what looked like a fortified command center. German soldiers were everywhere, easily 50 or 60, possibly double that. And in the center of it all, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, stood the warehouse where prisoners were being held. Even from a distance, Orlov could see movement through the windows, dozens of people packed into a space meant for cargo. "Jesus," Grekov whispered, "this isn't a supply depot. It's a fortress." Orlov said nothing, too busy counting guard positions, noting patrol patterns, identifying the critical infrastructure. The fuel depot was obvious, massive tanks on the southern edge. The rail lines were protected by regular patrols. The command center had dedicated guards, and what looked like communication equipment on the roof. This wasn't a target they could hit with 13 people and expect to survive. But while he watched, something happened that changed his calculation entirely. A German officer emerged from the command center, and with him walked a man in Soviet uniform who moved with the easy confidence of someone who belonged there. Grekov stiffened beside him. "Commander, is that—" "Yes." Orlov's voice was grim. "That's Captain Alexei Markov." Elena's husband looked healthy, well-fed, utterly at ease among the enemy. He was laughing at something the German officer said, gesturing animatedly as they walked toward the warehouse. "He's not a prisoner," Petrov observed. He's working with them voluntarily. They watched as Markov and the German officer entered the warehouse. Through the windows, Orlov could see the captain moving among the Soviet prisoners, speaking to them, apparently conducting some kind of interrogation or selection process. "What's he doing?" Sokolov asked. Orlov had a terrible suspicion he knew exactly what Markov was doing, identifying which prisoners had useful information or skills which could be turned or broken, which were expendable. It was the kind of collaboration that went beyond simple survival. This was active, enthusiastic betrayal. "Document everything," he told Grekov. "Photographs if possible, detailed notes if not. The commissar needs to see this." They observed for 8 more hours, rotating positions to avoid detection, carefully recording every detail. German shifts changed at regular intervals. Guard strength peaked during daylight and thinned at night. The fuel depot was serviced twice daily. Prisoner transport was scheduled for the following evening. Trucks would arrive at dusk, load the captives, and depart for the nearest rail hub before midnight. By the time they withdrew, Orlov had enough information to confirm what he'd suspected. A conventional assault was suicide, but an unconventional one, timed to exploit the chaos of prisoner loading, might just be possible. They returned to the fallback position well after dark. Elena met them immediately, her face tight with tension. "Well?" she demanded. "It's worse than we thought," Orlov said. He proceeded to outline what they'd observed: the strength of German forces, the layout of the complex, the prisoner transport schedule, and finally, reluctantly, what they'd seen Markov doing. Elena's face went absolutely blank as Orlov described her husband's collaboration, the way he'd moved among the prisoners like a predator selecting prey. When he finished, she stood motionless for a long moment. Then she walked away into the darkness. Orlov let her go. Some things needed to be processed alone. He gathered the rest of the team and laid out the reality. "We're looking at a reinforced garrison protecting a high-value objective. Any assault carries extreme risk. I'm not going to order anyone into a mission with these odds. So here's what I'm offering. We can abort now, report what we've learned to command, let them send a larger force. Or we can proceed with full knowledge that some of us probably won't come back." "What about the prisoners?" someone asked. "If we abort, they get transported to camps. Some might survive. Most won't." Orlov met each man's eyes. "If we hit the junction, we might free them. Might. But it'll cost us." Grekov spoke first. "I'm in. Those are our people in that warehouse. We don't leave our people." One by one, the others agreed. Not with enthusiasm or bravado, but with the grim resignation of men who'd already accepted death as probable and chosen meaning over safety. When Elena returned an hour later, her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. "I need to be on the team that enters the warehouse," she said. "Commissar, I need to see him, face to face. I need to—" She paused, searching for words. "I need to end this myself. Do you understand?" Orlov understood. This wasn't about revenge or justice. It was about closing a chapter, about refusing to let someone else write the ending to her story. "You'll be on beta team with me," he said. "We'll enter the warehouse together." Elena nodded, and in her eyes, Orlov saw something he recognized, the same cold certainty he'd felt when he'd placed the gun against Volkov's head, the knowledge that mercy sometimes looked like murder, and that the hardest choices were the ones that hollowed you out from the inside. They spent the rest of the night refining the plan, incorporating everything they'd learned. It was still insane, still dependent on luck and timing and a dozen things going perfectly. But it was a plan, and sometimes that was enough. As dawn approached and the team prepared to move into final positions, Orlov found himself thinking about the dam, about the 11 men he'd lost, about Volkov dying in the snow. This mission would cost them. The only question was whether the cost would be measured in casualties or complete annihilation. And somewhere in that warehouse, 200 prisoners waited for salvation that might never come, while a traitor walked free among their enemies. Tomorrow night, all of it would come to a head. Tomorrow night, they'd find out if desperate people making desperate choices could actually change anything, or if the war would simply devour them like it devoured everything else. Orlov checked his weapons one final time and tried not to think about the odds. Numbers didn't matter anymore. Only the mission mattered. Only the people right in front of him mattered. Everything else was just noise. The explosion that started everything came at exactly 1900 hours, just as the first transport trucks rolled through the junction's main gate. Sergeant Petrov's demolition work on the fuel depot was precise and devastating. The initial blast sent a fireball 200 feet into the air, followed by secondary explosions as adjacent tanks caught and added their fury to the conflagration. German soldiers scattered like ants from a kicked hill, some running toward the flames with fire equipment, others taking defensive positions against what they assumed was an artillery strike. In the chaos, nobody noticed the small team moving through shadows on the eastern perimeter. Orlov led Beta Team, himself, Elena, Grekov, Sokolov, and two others, toward the warehouse while the junction descended into pandemonium. The guard towers that had seemed so formidable during reconnaissance now stood empty, their occupants diverted to fight the fire or reinforce the main gate where Alpha Team was creating a noisy diversion. 60 seconds to the warehouse, Orlov whispered into his radio. Alpha, status? Petrov's voice crackled back, barely audible over gunfire. Engaged with approximately 20 Germans. They think we're a larger force. We're falling back as planned, but they're pursuing hard. Keep them busy for 5 more minutes. Copy that. Try not to get killed in there, Commander. Beta Team reached the warehouse's eastern wall without incident. Orlov pressed against the weathered wood, listening. Inside he could hear voices, German guards shouting orders, prisoners responding in Russian, the general commotion of people being herded toward trucks. Grekov, the door, Orlov ordered. The corporal moved forward with a small explosive charge, something he'd rigged to blow hinges without bringing down the whole wall. He placed it carefully, checked the detonation cord, then looked back at Orlov. On your mark, Commander. Elena moved up beside Orlov, her pistol drawn. In the firelight from the burning fuel depot, he could see her face, completely controlled, emotionless, a mask that revealed nothing of whatever storm raged beneath. Whatever happens in there, Orlov said quietly, you follow my lead. Understood. Understood. But he didn't believe her, and from the way her hand tightened on her weapon, she didn't believe herself either. Grekov, blow it! The charge detonated with a sharp crack, and the door simply ceased to exist. Orlov went through first, weapon up, scanning for immediate threats. The warehouse was enormous, a cavernous space lit by harsh electric lights. Prisoners, maybe 200 just as intelligence had suggested, were lined up in ragged columns, being counted and catalogued by German guards. And standing near the far end, clipboard in hand like this was just another bureaucratic exercise, was Captain Alexei Markov. Elena saw him at the same moment Orlov did. Her entire body went rigid, and for a heartbeat Orlov thought she might do something catastrophically stupid. But then her training reasserted itself, and she moved with the team, covering angles, clearing space. The Germans reacted slowly, confused by the explosion and the sudden appearance of armed Soviets in a supposedly secure facility. That hesitation cost them. Orlov's team opened fire with brutal efficiency, dropping 4 guards in the first 3 seconds. Everyone down, Orlov shouted in Russian to the prisoners. Down on the floor, now! Most obeyed instantly, conditioned by weeks of captivity to follow any order shouted with sufficient authority. A few stood frozen, unable to process that salvation might actually be arriving. The remaining German guards, 6, maybe 7, scrambled for cover and began returning fire. Bullets cracked through the air, splintering wood, punching through the thin walls. Sokolov went down with a grunt, clutching his shoulder, but he kept firing one-handed. And through it all, Markov simply stood there, watching with an expression that suggested mild curiosity rather than fear. Beta Team, secure the exits, Orlov ordered. Grekov, get those prisoners moving toward the east door. Anyone who can fight, arm them with captured weapons. The team moved to execute his orders, while Orlov advanced on Markov. The captain made no move to flee or fight, just watched Orlov approach with an unsettling calmness. Commander Orlov, Markov said in Russian, his voice carrying clearly despite the gunfire. I've heard about you, the dam destroyer. Quite impressive work. On your knees, hands behind your head. I think not. Markov smiled slightly. You see, you're operating under several misapprehensions. The first is that you're in control of this situation. As if on cue, the warehouse's main doors burst open and German soldiers poured in, at least 20, heavily armed, moving with the coordinated precision of experienced infantry. Alpha Team's diversion had worked too well, drawn too many enemies, and now the Germans were converging back on the warehouse. Orlov's team was trapped between two forces, outnumbered and outgunned. The second misapprehension, Markov continued, raising his voice to be heard over renewed gunfire, is that I'm simply a traitor. But traitor implies I was ever truly loyal. I wasn't. I was pragmatic, and pragmatism suggested that Germany's victory was inevitable, so why die for a losing cause? Grekov, barricade that door, Orlov shouted, but it was too late. His team was pinned down, taking fire from multiple directions, the careful plan disintegrating into desperate survival. Then Elena appeared from behind a stack of crates, moving with purpose directly toward her husband. Markov saw her, and his smile faded, replaced by something that might have been genuine surprise. "Elena," he said, "I wondered if you'd come." "Shut your mouth," her voice was ice. "You don't get to speak to me. You don't get to explain or justify or make excuses. I'm not making excuses. I'm offering you a choice." Markov gestured toward the chaos around them. "This is suicide. You know it. I know it. But it doesn't have to end this way. The Germans will accept your surrender. They value political officers. You could provide useful intelligence. Live comfortably while this war grinds to its inevitable conclusion. You mean betray my people like you did? I mean survive, which is more than you'll do if you keep fighting." Around them, the battle was turning against Orlov's team. The German reinforcements had superior positions and numbers. Sokolov was down and bleeding heavily. Another soldier, Private Dmitry Koval, lay motionless near the shattered east door. The prisoners were screaming, caught between the two forces. And in the middle of it all, Elena Markova stood facing the man she'd married, the man who'd promised to stand beside her through anything, the man who'd chosen comfort over conviction. "I used to think I loved you," she said quietly, "but that was before I understood what love actually meant. Love isn't about words or promises. It's about choices. And you chose yourself over everyone else. As did you coming here. This isn't about saving prisoners. This is about revenge." "No." Elena's hand moved to her pistol. "This is about ending a mistake." She fired 3 times. The first bullet hit Markov in the chest, the second in the stomach, the third in the throat as he fell. He went down hard, blood spreading across his uniform, eyes wide with shock that his wife, his Elena, had actually pulled the trigger. For a moment, the warehouse seemed to freeze, everyone processing what had just happened. Then Elena turned away from her husband's dying body as if he'd never existed and raised her voice to address the prisoners. "Anyone who wants to live, listen to me. The guards' weapons are on the floor. Take them. Form up behind the eastern barricade. We're getting out of here, but you have to fight." Something extraordinary happened then. The prisoners, who'd been cowering and passive, transformed. Years of accumulated rage, weeks of humiliation and fear, found a sudden outlet. They surged forward, grabbing weapons from dead guards, forming into rough fighting units with the desperate efficiency of people who had nothing left to lose. Orlov saw it happening and immediately adapted his plan. Instead of trying to extract his team through overwhelming enemy fire, he reorganized around the prisoners' anger. "Grekov, take 20 prisoners and hit their left flank. Use the captured MG-42 on that position. Petrov..." He paused, realizing Petrov was with Alpha Team outside. "Sokolov, can you still fight?" The wounded private gritted his teeth and nodded. "Well enough. Take the right flank. Keep them pinned while we organize a breakout." What followed was less a tactical operation and more controlled chaos. The prisoners fought with a ferocity born of desperation, advancing where trained soldiers would have taken cover, accepting casualties that would have broken regular units. The Germans, expecting passive resistance, found themselves facing a howling mob that seemed to care more about killing than surviving. In that chaos, Orlov saw an opportunity. "Elena, with me. We're taking the command center." She followed without question, reloading her pistol as they ran. They burst from the warehouse into a junction, now completely consumed by fire and violence. The fuel depot was still burning, casting everything in hellish orange light. Alpha Team's firefight had evolved into a running battle across the rail yards, and everywhere, freed prisoners were scattering into the night, some armed, some just running, all of them making it impossible for the Germans to maintain any coherent defense. The command center stood 50 meters away, its guards divided between defending the building and responding to threats across the junction. Orlov and Elena covered the distance in a sprinting crouch, using burning vehicles and equipment for concealment. They hit the entrance hard, Elena going low while Orlov went high, a practiced breach that dropped 2 guards before they could react. Inside the command center was organized chaos, officers shouting into radios, staff trying to coordinate a response to simultaneous crises, maps and documents scattered everywhere. Orlov shot the senior officer first, a major who'd been in the middle of ordering reinforcements. The man went down clutching his chest, and suddenly the entire room's attention swung toward the 2 Soviets who'd somehow penetrated their headquarters. Elena moved like a dancer through deadly choreography, her pistol barking sharp reports as she engaged targets with clinical precision. She'd transformed completely from the political officer who'd sat in briefing rooms. This was someone who'd found purpose in violence, who'd channeled grief and rage into perfectly executed combat. Together, they cleared the command center in under a minute. When the last German fell, Orlov moved immediately to the radio equipment. "Can you operate this?" he asked Elena. She studied the German radio for a moment, then nodded. "Give me 30 seconds." While she worked, Orlov grabbed every document he could find: operational orders, troop dispositions, coded messages. Intelligence that could be invaluable if they actually survived to deliver it. Elena's hands flew over the radio controls, and suddenly German voices were crackling through speakers, demanding status reports, ordering units to converge on the junction. "I can broadcast on their frequency," Elena said. "Confuse their response, maybe buy us time." "Do it!" She began speaking rapid German into the microphone, impersonating a panicked officer reporting that the junction was being overrun by a full Soviet battalion, that they needed immediate evacuation, that all units should fall back to secondary positions. It was a brilliant deception. German units across the region would hear the broadcast and respond accordingly, pulling forces away from the junction just when they were most needed. Outside, the battle was reaching its crescendo. Orlov could hear explosions, likely the rail lines being destroyed by charges Grekov had planted during the initial assault. More explosions followed as ammunition stores caught fire. The entire junction was transforming from a strategic asset into a liability, a burning ruin that would take weeks to rebuild. "We need to extract," Orlov said. "Alpha Team, status?" Petrov's voice came back, breathless but alive. "We're mobile, Commander. Casualties but operational. Where are you?" "Command Center. Rally point is the north tree line, 200 meters past the fence. Signal when you're in position." "Copy. Moving now." Orlov turned to Elena. "Time to go, Commissar." She broadcast one final message in German, a fabricated order for all units to withdraw to defensive positions, then smashed the radio with her pistol. They grabbed the documents and moved toward the exit, but paused at the doorway. Outside was a vision of absolute devastation. The fuel depot had spread fire to adjacent buildings. The warehouse where they'd freed the prisoners was now an inferno. Rail cars burned like Roman candles, their cargo adding toxic smoke to the already choking air. German soldiers and freed prisoners were locked in desperate firefights across the facility, neither side able to gain clear advantage in the chaos. And through it all, groups of prisoners were escaping into the night, disappearing into the forest, using the confusion to slip away while their captors were too overwhelmed to stop them. "We did it," Elena said, her voice filled with something like wonder. "Against all odds, we actually did it. We're not clear yet. Stay close." They ran from the command center toward the northern perimeter, using the chaos as cover. Halfway there, they encountered a group of German soldiers attempting to establish a defensive line. Orlov didn't hesitate. He pulled a grenade from his belt, cooked it for 2 seconds, and threw it with perfect accuracy into the center of the group. The explosion scattered the Germans, and Orlov and Elena sprinted through the gap, firing at anything that moved. A bullet cracked past Orlov's head, close enough that he felt the heat. Another stitched the ground at his feet. Then they were at the fence, and Grekov was there with wire cutters, opening a path while providing covering fire. They tumbled through into the relative safety of the forest beyond, where the rest of Beta Team waited. Orlov did a quick count. 8 of his original 13 were here, including Elena. 5 dead or missing, including the prisoners who joined the fight. Better than he'd expected. Worse than he'd hoped. Alpha Team, he called into the radio. We're clear, Commander. 4 effectives plus about 30 prisoners we picked up during the retreat. Moving to rally point now. Copy. Maintain radio silence from here. We go dark and move fast. The team pushed into the forest, putting distance between themselves and the burning junction. Behind them, explosions continued as fire found new fuel, new ammunition, new reasons to burn. The entire facility was doomed now. Even if the Germans managed to contain the fires, the damage would take months to repair. They'd succeeded. Against impossible odds, with improvised planning and desperate courage, they'd actually succeeded. But the cost was written in the faces of the soldiers around Orlov, in the blood-soaked bandages, in the empty spaces where friends had stood hours earlier. They rendezvoused with Alpha Team 3 kilometers from the junction, deep enough in the forest that the glow of flames was barely visible through the trees. Petrov looked like he'd aged 10 years, his face haggard and streaked with soot. We lost 6, he reported quietly. Another 4 wounded badly enough they might not make it home. But the prisoners, he gestured to the ragged group of freed Soviets clustered nearby. They fought like devils, Commander. Never seen anything like it. Orlov looked at the liberated prisoners. They were battered, malnourished, bearing the scars of captivity. But in their eyes burned something that hadn't been there before. Hope, maybe, or just the fierce satisfaction of having struck back at their tormentors. One of them, an older man with a colonel's insignia on his tattered uniform, approached Orlov. "You're the commander?" he asked. "Acting commander. Mikhail Orlov. Colonel Ivan Volkov. I was captured 3 weeks ago when my unit was overrun." The name hit Orlov like a physical blow. Volkov, same as his dead sergeant. The universe's sense of irony was cruel. "I want to thank you for what you did back there. Most of us had given up hope." "Thank the men who didn't make it out," Orlov said. "They paid for your freedom. We'll honor them, and we'll make their sacrifice count." Volkov looked back at the other freed prisoners. "We're combat personnel, Commander. If you'll have us, we'd like to join your unit for the journey home." Orlov considered. More people meant slower movement, higher risk of detection, but it also meant more weapons, more eyes watching for danger, more strength if they encountered German patrols. "You're welcome to join," he said finally. "But we do this my way. No arguments, no debates. Clear?" "Crystal clear, Commander." The enlarged group began moving west, navigating by compass and stars. They traveled through the night and into the next day, stopping only briefly for rest and to treat the wounded. The forest seemed endless, a maze of trees and shadows that all looked the same. Elena walked beside Orlov, silent and withdrawn. She hadn't spoken since leaving the junction, hadn't acknowledged the other soldiers' attempts at conversation. Orlov let her alone with whatever thoughts occupied her mind. But on the second night, after they'd established a cold camp in a defensible ravine, she finally spoke. "I killed him," she said quietly. "My husband. I looked him in the eye and I killed him." "You did what had to be done." "Did I? Or did I just want revenge for being betrayed?" Elena's hands were shaking. "I keep telling myself it was duty, that he was a traitor and deserved to die. But the truth is, in that moment, I wanted him dead. Not for the state, not for the mission. Just because." Orlov sat down beside her. "Volkov asked me to kill him. Made it sound noble, like mercy. But part of me wanted it too. Wanted to not have to carry him, not have to slow down, not have to watch him suffer. So I pulled the trigger and told myself it was kindness." He paused. "Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. But either way, he's dead and I'm alive, and I have to live with that choice." "How do you live with it?" "By not lying to myself about why I made it, and by making sure his death meant something." Orlov looked at the sleeping soldiers around them, at the freed prisoners who'd joined their ranks. "We saved people tonight, Commissar. Freed prisoners who would have died in camps, destroyed a junction that was feeding German war efforts, lost friends doing it, made choices we'll question forever. But we saved people. That has to count for something. Elena nodded slowly. When we get back, the NKVD will question me about Alexei, about whether I knew he was collaborating, whether I helped him, whether I can be trusted. And what will you tell them? The truth. That I killed a traitor who threatened the mission, that I chose duty over personal attachment. She met Orlov's eyes. And I'll have you and the entire team to corroborate it. Plus the documents we captured, which prove his collaboration. The NKVD can't argue with that kind of evidence. They can argue with anything if they're determined enough. Then I'll make them understand that I'm more useful alive than dead, that I've proven my loyalty in ways that matter. Elena's voice hardened. I'm done being afraid of my own side, Commander. I'd rather die fighting Germans than cower before some NKVD interrogator. Orlov smiled despite himself. That's the kind of attitude that gets political officers shot. Or promoted. We'll find out which. They continued west for 5 more days, moving through territory that shifted gradually from German-controlled to contested to finally, miraculously, Soviet. When they finally crossed through their own lines, the guards almost shot them. A ragged group of soldiers and civilians appearing out of the forest wasn't exactly standard protocol, but Colonel Volkov knew the codes and countersigns, and eventually they convinced the sentries they were legitimate. Word spread quickly that Commander Orlov had returned from another impossible mission, this time bringing 30 freed prisoners and intelligence documents that detailed German positions across an entire sector. The debriefing took 3 days. Orlov and Elena were separated immediately, questioned by different officers, their stories compared for inconsistencies. The NKVD sent Major Kashin to conduct Elena's interrogation personally, a process that lasted 14 hours and left her exhausted but defiant. When she finally emerged, Orlov was waiting outside the interrogation room. Well, he asked. They're satisfied. Or as satisfied as the NKVD ever gets. Elena looked drained but relieved. The documents we captured included communications from Alexei to German intelligence. They prove he was actively collaborating, which means I'm cleared of suspicion by association. Kashin actually thanked me for eliminating a traitor. And the mission? Complete success, according to official reports. The rail junction is out of commission for at least 2 months. German supply lines in the entire sector are disrupted, and we freed approximately 200 prisoners, 40 of whom made it back to our lines and are being reassigned to combat units. Orlov processed that. 200 prisoners freed, but only 40 survived the escape. The others were recaptured, killed during the breakout, or lost in the forest. Still, 40 lives saved from certain death in labor camps. 40 people who got to see their families again, fight for their homeland, die on their own terms rather than as slaves. It had to be enough. What about you? Elena asked. What did they say? Kashin wants me to continue special operations, said I have a talent for impossible missions. Orlov's tone was dry. I'm being promoted to major and given command of an independent sabotage unit. Basically, they're going to keep sending me behind enemy lines until I finally don't come back. Will you accept? Do I have a choice? We always have choices, Commander. The question is which ones we can live with. They stood together in the corridor, 2 people who'd survived hell through a combination of skill, luck, and sheer bloody-minded refusal to surrender. Around them, the machinery of war continued, soldiers marching, officers shouting orders, the endless grinding process that consumed lives and spat out statistics. I'm being reassigned too, Elena said. Political officer attached to your unit. Apparently my performance in the field impressed someone important. They want me to continue documenting your missions. So we're stuck with each other. Seems that way. She paused. I can't decide if that's a blessing or a curse. Little bit of both, probably. 2 weeks later, they stood in a military cemetery outside the city, attending a memorial service for the soldiers who'd died during the junction raid. The graves were fresh, the markers simple wooden crosses bearing names and ranks. Sergeant Petrov had survived but lost his left eye to shrapnel. He stood at attention beside Orlov, his face bandaged but his spine straight. Grekov was there too, and Sokolov, recovering from his shoulder wound but already cleared for duty. The survivors of both teams, diminished but unbroken, honoring the dead who'd made their survival possible. A general whose name Orlov didn't catch gave a speech about sacrifice and duty. Elena stood beside the general, reading from prepared remarks about heroism and the triumph of the human spirit. The words washed over Orlov like water, meaningless and empty. What mattered were the names on those crosses. Private Dmitry Koval, Corporal Alexei Fedorov, Lieutenant Boris Malenkov. 7 others whose families would receive letters explaining that their sons, husbands, fathers had died serving the state. The letters wouldn't mention the fear, the pain, the moments of doubt. They wouldn't describe how Koval had died clutching his stomach, trying to hold his intestines in while begging for his mother. They wouldn't explain that Fedorov had bled out slowly because there was no time to stop and treat his wounds properly. They'd just say, killed in action, died heroically, gave his life for the motherland. And maybe that was better. Maybe the families didn't need to know the ugly reality of how their loved ones had spent their final moments. Maybe the clean narrative was its own kind of mercy. After the ceremony, as people dispersed, Colonel Volkov approached Orlov. The former prisoner had been restored to active duty and given command of a rifle division. "I wanted to thank you again," Volkov said, "for what you did. My family thought I was dead. Because of you, I got to see my wife and children again. Thank the people in those graves. They paid for it." "I know, and I'll make sure their sacrifice wasn't wasted." Volkov clasped Orlov's hand. "If you ever need anything, Commander, anything at all, you call on me. I owe you a debt I can never repay." After he left, Elena moved to stand beside Orlov. "You did well," she said quietly. "Gave those men purpose. Made their deaths mean something. Their deaths mean they're not here anymore. Everything else is just words we use to make ourselves feel better. Maybe, but words matter. Stories matter. They're how we remember, how we honor, how we keep going when everything else says to quit." Elena looked at the graves. "Your sergeant, the one you had to kill, what was his name?" "Dmitry Volkov. Same name as the colonel." "I noticed." "You think that means something? Fate or coincidence or—" "I think it means the universe has a twisted sense of humor." Orlov turned away from the graves. "Come on, we've got another briefing in an hour. Kashin wants to discuss the next mission." They walked together across the cemetery, leaving the dead behind but carrying them forward all the same. Because that was what the living did. They carried the weight of those who'd fallen, adding each new loss to the burden they already bore. The next mission came 3 days later. Another impossible objective. Another suicide run behind enemy lines. Orlov briefed his team, expanded now to 20 soldiers, all volunteers who'd heard about the Junction raid and wanted to be part of something larger than themselves. Elena documented everything, her camera capturing moments of preparation, her notes recording conversations and decisions. She was building a narrative, creating propaganda that would inspire other soldiers, other units, making heroes out of desperate people doing desperate things. And maybe that was okay. Maybe the world needed heroes more than it needed truth. Maybe belief in something larger than yourself was worth preserving, even if that belief was built on carefully curated stories that omitted the messy, ugly, complicated reality. They deployed at dawn, heading east into enemy territory once more. Orlov led from the front. Elena walked beside him, and 20 soldiers followed because they'd chosen to believe that individual action could make a difference. The mission went sideways on the second day. They encountered a German patrol twice the size intelligence had predicted, lost 3 men in the initial contact, and had to abort the primary objective in favor of basic survival. But they adapted, adjusted, found a different target, a communication hub that intelligence hadn't even known existed, and hit it with the same desperate innovation that had characterized the Junction raid. They came home with 12 soldiers instead of 20, having lost 8 more names to add to the growing list. But they'd disrupted German communications across an entire front, bought Soviet forces time to reposition, saved countless lives through their sacrifice. And the cycle continued. Mission after mission, month after month, Orlov's unit conducted operations that shouldn't have succeeded. They destroyed bridges, sabotaged supply depots, assassinated officers, spread chaos deep in enemy territory. The cost was measured in graves, in missing soldiers, in the haunted look that settled permanently into survivors' eyes. But they kept going. Because stopping meant admitting that all those deaths had been for nothing, and none of them could accept that. Elena documented everything, building a legend around Orlov and his unit. The story spread through the ranks. The commander who'd destroyed a dam with 11 men, who'd freed 200 prisoners from a fortified junction, who seemed impossible to kill despite walking into death over and over again. Soldiers volunteered for his unit, knowing they probably wouldn't survive. But they came anyway, drawn by the promise that their deaths would matter, that they'd be part of something larger than the anonymous grinding horror of conventional warfare. And in quiet moments, when the missions were complete and the dead were buried and the survivors tried to sleep, Orlov and Elena would talk about what they'd become. "We're using them," Elena said one night, after a particularly brutal mission that had cost 14 lives. "Feeding the legend, making them believe they're heroes, sending them to die for objectives that might not even matter in the grand scheme of the war." "I know," Orlov replied. "But what's the alternative? Tell them the truth? That war is meaningless chaos, that their deaths accomplish nothing lasting, that we're all just pieces being sacrificed in a game played by people who've never seen combat?" Maybe that would be more honest. Honesty doesn't win wars. Belief does. Hope does. The conviction that sacrifice means something. Orlov stared into darkness. Even if it's a lie we tell ourselves to keep fighting. Elena was quiet for a long time, then, "When this is over, if we survive, what becomes of us? What do people like us do in a world at peace?" "I don't think there is a world at peace. Not for us. We've seen too much, done too much. Even if the fighting stops, we'll carry it forever." That's a depressing thought. It's an honest one. The war ground on. Seasons changed. Winter became spring, became summer, became fall, became winter again. Orlov's unit, officially designated Special Operations Group Orlov, conducted 43 missions over 18 months. They lost 112 soldiers. They achieved objectives that military historians would later call decisive, turning points that helped shift the balance of the entire Eastern Front. And through it all, Elena Markova documented everything, transforming brutal reality into inspiring narrative, making sure that each death was recorded, each sacrifice noted, each act of courage preserved for posterity. When the war finally ended, not with triumph but with exhausted collapse, both sides too broken to continue, Orlov and Elena stood together on a hilltop overlooking the city they'd left years earlier. The city had changed. Buildings that had stood for centuries were rubble. Streets they'd known were cratered and burned. The population was a fraction of what it had been, everyone having lost someone, everyone carrying scars visible and invisible. "We won," Elena said, though she didn't sound convinced. "We survived," Orlov corrected. "That's not the same thing." They'd both been promoted multiple times. Orlov was now a full colonel, decorated with medals he didn't want and recognition he didn't believe he deserved. Elena had become one of the most respected political officers in the service, her documentation of the war used in training and propaganda across the country. And both of them were hollowed out inside, emptied by years of sending people to die for objectives that seemed urgent in the moment and meaningless in retrospect. "What do we do now?" Elena asked. "I don't know. They want me to help train the next generation of special operations officers, pass on what I've learned." Orlov's laugh was bitter. "As if there's anything worth teaching beyond try not to get everyone killed. You saved more lives than you cost. The missions killed 112 people under my direct command, plus however many enemies we killed, however many civilians got caught in the crossfire. The ledger doesn't balance, Elena. It never balances." She had no answer to that. Because he was right, and they both knew it. They stood in silence, watching the sun set over a broken city, two people who'd survived hell and found that survival was its own kind of damnation. But they'd also saved lives, freed prisoners, struck blows against an enemy that had seemed invincible, created moments of hope in an ocean of despair. Maybe that was enough. Maybe it had to be. Because the alternative was admitting that all of it, the sacrifice, the suffering, the endless accumulation of ghosts, had been for nothing. And neither of them could accept that. So they stood together and watched the sunset and made silent promises to the dead that their memories would be preserved, their sacrifices honored, their names remembered even when everyone who'd known them was gone. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't even justice. But it was all they had. And sometimes, in a world that had burned itself to ashes, survival and memory were the only victories worth claiming. The war was over. The living remained. And the stories, cleaned up, made noble, stripped of their ugliest truths, would be told to future generations who would never fully understand the cost of each word. But that was the price of history, of heroism, of trying to find meaning in chaos. Orlov and Elena walked down from the hilltop together, carrying the weight of everything they'd done and seen, heading toward whatever future waited for broken people in a broken world. Behind them, the sun disappeared below the horizon, and darkness claimed the landscape. But somewhere in that darkness, their story would survive. Imperfect, incomplete, but true enough to honor the people who'd lived it and died for it. And maybe that was enough. Maybe it had to be.